In total, if you add all of the money for projects for truly renewable energies, the kind of energy harnessed from sources that generate themselves, so like solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, and the battery storage research and projects to store that energy that they produce at odd hours, if you take all of that combined, renewable energy is funded with a total of $1.5 billion. Compared to $9.5 billion authorized for our transition to a clean hydrogen economy. This just isn't like moving the goalposts. This is like showing up to a soccer game and being handed a rugby ball. Because until reading this bill, I was under the impression, and I've been reading bills and laws for almost a decade now. I also know what we have signed in international treaties. From all of this education that I have had over the last decade, I was under the impression that the goal was a truly green economy powered by renewable energy. Now, we've been told that natural gas, a fossil fuel, would be a bridge fuel to that. I was under the impression that the Republicans and corporate Democrats who take fossil fuel industry money were dragging their heels on the path to that. But this bill would put us on a totally different path, and we aren't even being told that we're switching directions.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 240th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If it's your first time listening to Congressional Dish, I am a American citizen who just wants to know what Congress is doing with my money and in my name. I started looking into bills and laws and watching lots of hearings towards the beginning of the Obama years. I was just like watching C-SPAN and looking into stuff, and I was going pretty insane because I was finding things in legislation that weren't being covered, not only not enough by the corporate media, but in many cases not at all. And I just found that there was so much that was in these bills and laws that had direct effects on our lives. And I just felt like we should be a part of that conversation. And because I felt like I was one of the only people in the country that knew a lot of this stuff, I was going completely insane. And so I started this podcast with the hopes that it would basically be like therapy. That was the personal motivation. I also like the idea of having a job that could travel with me because I am now a digital nomad. That is what I've been working towards for pretty much my entire adult life. But when it came to what I wanted to do all day, every day, is I wanted to share what I was finding in these bills and laws, tell people how it affects us, and do it from the perspective of someone who doesn't give a damn about either of the parties. In general, I can't stand politics. I feel like politics gets in the way of good governing. I want to see what happens after elections and see what they're doing and how it affects our lives. And so this is one of those episodes that is very much along the lines of that original mission of looking into bills and laws and seeing how it affects our future, our lives, affects us. And so today I read a decent chunk of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. And part of this is so that I can back up some things that I've been saying on quite a few different podcasts, including my own thank you episode. I also went back on the Bad Faith podcast. I did their Patreon episode. I got to meet David Sirota, which was super exciting for me and had a really good conversation, but I trashed the infrastructure bill. And I also trashed the infrastructure bill on Politics, where I got to talk once again with my friends, Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton. And so I just said, I really don't like the infrastructure bill. And so today I'm going to back up that commentary with the facts. I'm doing this a little backwards because usually I present the facts and then tell you what I think about them. And this is going to be the other way around since you already know how I feel. But just so you know, I couldn't read the entire bill this week because it's 2,740 pages. But I looked into, first of all, I read the entire table of contents and I highlighted the provisions that seemed the most consequential, the ones that had the most potential for me to be excited about. Actually, I was looking for things that I wanted to become law. And so everything that I found, everything I read, I did do a partial outline of the bill so you can see all of the provisions that I read. I'm not going to tell you about all of them today, but my outline is in this episode's show notes for you. If this bill does become law, I will finish that outline and tell you the rest. But I just want to hit the big stuff today so you can understand when you hear about the infrastructure bill, the main points about what's actually in it, which is something that has very strangely been left out of the national conversation when we talk about this bill. It's all about the process. It's all about it being linked to another bill and how it's going to become law, but no one has told us what's in it. And I found some really, really surprising things. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. The stuff that I looked into that I thought I would be excited about, but I, more than anything, found a lot of red flags. So yeah, I hate the infrastructure bill. So let me get started with telling you why. Oh, and by the way, I do have to mention this right up front because we're struggling again. This podcast is listener supported. We operate on the value for value funding model, which means I do work that is of value, as in I read things like the transportation bill, tell you what's in them, and create a podcast episode about it. And if you value the work that is done, the deal is you are requested to return that value in some kind of financial form, whatever feels fair to you and in whatever method works best for you. We take PayPal, Venmo. We have a Patreon. If you don't like all of the censorship that I put over my swear words, you can get a separate feed that doesn't have those in it. If you contribute on Patreon, we take paper checks. So if you don't want to have any middleman taking a commission out of our transactions between each other, send in a paper check to the Florida address. It gets sent to my sister and she processes all of the checks for us. All of the options are listed for you on congressionaldish.com, but we are in another funding dry spell. And so I know a lot of you guys hate when I remind you how this business model works, but there are a lot of people that are not participating in it. And so I need to let you know that if you want this podcast to continue, that's how you can make that happen. So yeah, please support the show, congressionaldish.com, which by the way, we have a new website. It's beautiful. So check it out because the show notes for this episode are really important. I'm going to give you all my sources. The outline will take you to the individual provisions of all of the things I'm going to tell you about today. There are articles and studies and bills and all kinds of stuff in those show notes to back up everything I say, because I don't expect you to trust me either. That takes a lot of work and I pay people to help me. So please support me by paying for the show. Okay, so now let's talk about BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. And the first thing, one of the most important things that you need to know at this juncture is that this is a bill. It's a bill. And this is why I've been so hesitant to even talk about it, because none of this has become law and it might not ever become law. And I've been burned quite a few times where I think one of these big bills is on its way to the finish line and I read it and I tell you all about it and then like, whoopsie, none of that happened. And I know that's caused confusion in the past. I really want to be able to tell you that something's going to change your life when it actually is. And everything I'm telling you today, this could be society altering stuff if it becomes law, but that's still a big if. So please understand this is a bill. But the reason I'm willing to spend time, energy, and money reading and reporting on a significant portion of the bill is that this bill has already passed the Senate by a vote of 69-30, with 19 Republicans voting for it to get it over the Senate finish line. And you know, that bipartisanship, the fact that it was Democrats and Republicans, that's why it's nicknamed the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, because Republicans got their oily hands all over it, and inside of the bill, it shows. Now, as for the House of Representatives has been completely sidelined in this process. I was excited when Representative Pete DeFazio of Oregon was named the chairman of the House Transportation Committee, because he's someone who actually does care about upgrading our transportation infrastructure in a way that makes it less reliant on fossil fuels. And his committee wrote a bill that, just from the table of contents, I know I liked a lot more than the Senate version. And so the House version passed the House of Representatives 221-201, with all Democrats voting yes, along with only 2 Republicans from the Northeast joining them. So that one was a much more partisan bill. Now, the way this is supposed to work from here is that at this point, we have 2 bills, one from the House and one from the Senate, and they are different. Now, since all bills need to pass the House and the Senate in identical form before becoming law, there should be a conference where members from the House and the Senate sit their asses in some conference room, order pizza, and compromise until they agree on a merged bill. And then that bill that comes out of that conference should get a vote in both chambers and then go to Sleepy Joe to get signed into law. But that's not the process that's happening here. Because the Democrats have only 50 votes in the Senate, it's weird saying only because they have 50 votes in the Senate and the tiebreaker since the vice president, a Democrat named Kamala Harris, since she is the tiebreaker, technically you would think that they would have enough votes to pass bills. But they don't have enough senators to get around a tool of legislative obstruction known as the filibuster, which basically raises the threshold needed to pass things to 60 votes if anyone in the Senate objects to what's going on. Now, the Democrats do have the ability to get rid of that tool for obstruction, but they're refusing to do so because they want it to be available for themselves the next time the Republicans take power. But anyway, because Republican obstruction has been given power that the Democrats refuse to take away in the Senate, the version of the infrastructure bill that passed the Senate is the one that the Democrats, as the party in charge of both chambers right now, have chosen to go with. There will be no conference, which means that the Senate bill is the infrastructure bill. Pete DeFazio and all of the good provisions that do good things like the $400 million it had to fund the installation of public electric car charging stations. That was left out of the infrastructure bill because the House was completely sidelined. Basically, this process essentially tells Pete DeFazio and every one of our representatives in the House to go ahead and fuck themselves. They will get no say in this legislation. And I think that's just plain wrong. But that's the reality of it. The reality is that if we are getting an infrastructure bill this year, this is likely it. And this is likely the draft that would be signed by President Joe Biden. And while we're on the subject of process, I might as well get this out of the way now. The fight in Congress right now is actually not over this bill. This one's essentially a done deal. But the fight is instead over another bill that's expected to be passed at the same time, because that's what was promised to the progressive Democrats in order to get their support for this garbage infrastructure bill. The other bill that the progressives want is the reconciliation bill. That's supposed to have the Democrats' priorities in it. But the problem at this juncture is that I can't tell you what exactly those priorities are and what that means and what's in the reconciliation bill because that's being negotiated behind closed doors right now. But basically, if that bill goes down, then this one probably will too. And so my point is, once again, this is a bill. Do not yet think that this stuff is definitely going to happen. You still have a chance to make your opinion about it known to Congress to try to kill it. Or if you love fossil fuels and extreme weather and dead birds and swimming in poison, you can call Congress to support it if you want to too. And before I get into the actual bill, I should probably warn you that I am coming at this with a renewed fury about our use of fossil fuels right now. And you can probably already sense it. So I might as well tell you what's going on now. Plus, quite a few of you saw my mental breakdown on Instagram. So let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room. So as a digital nomad, answering the question of where are you from is kind of difficult for me. And I have roots that are spread far and wide, from Hawaii to Germany to Boston to Montana to Colorado to so many different places. But the trunk of my family tree is rooted quite firmly in Irvine, California. My family moved there in 1988. I was 6 years old and my mother still lives there. So when I go home for the holidays, that is where I stay. When I was growing up, Laguna Beach was the beach that my parents loved the most. And some of my favorite memories, and we did this a lot, was going down to Laguna Beach and going and checking out all the little animals that were in the tide pools. Because when the tide pulls out of Laguna Beach, there are just these amazing spots in the rocks that are full of hermit crabs and sea anemones. I've even found an octopus down there. It's so cool. My dad used to take me down there all the time to look in the tide pools. Then when I went to high school, my hangout beaches became Newport Beach and Huntington Beach. And that's really when I was made aware of the oil infrastructure off of our coasts. And that's when I started to really worry about it. because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of rigs and they're way out there in the ocean, but they're too close for comfort for me. And so pretty much since high school, I have been dreading the day that something would happen at those rigs and put oil all over my favorite beaches. And that day is here. So on Friday, there were people in Huntington Beach that were calling in to the authorities saying that they could smell some kind of toxic gas coming in off of the ocean. Then on Saturday, there was the second day of the air show, and air shows are a big deal in Orange County. We used to go every year to the El Toro Air Base and watch the Blue Angels. It's like a big thing. And 1.5 million people, including some of my friends and their children, went to Huntington Beach that day, all day long to watch the air show. Meanwhile, the smell was still there. People were still reporting it. A lot of people said that they assumed that it was something with the air show because obviously there's exhaust, but it was a stronger smell than that. But people stayed and they watched the air show because they had no idea that there was a pipeline on the bottom of the seafloor that had been leaking for over a day. At this point, we don't really know what caused the spill, but we have found a 13-inch crack in the pipeline. That crack is in a section where the pipeline itself, it used to be straight, and now it's bent. And so it does appear like it's possible that a ship's anchor dragged it and split it open. But the thing about that particular pipeline is that it is old. It's 41 years old. And any safety mechanisms that were supposed to be there to detect any drop in pressure so that the company could turn off the pipeline, all of those safety features failed because we know that this thing was punctured on a Friday and they didn't turn it off until Saturday night. Even more disturbing is that the public wasn't informed about any of this. And so people were surfing in the oil. There were people, obviously, that were outside breathing in all those toxic fumes. And so the beaches weren't closed until Sunday. Now, an oil spill of this size, we've been told that it's 144,000 gallons of oil. And the fact that it was on the bottom of the seafloor, this is one of those slow rolling disasters. And we really don't know what the final extent of it is going to be because so much of it is already on the ocean floor. It's not like you can just suck it up. It's not like it's spilled from a ship and it's floating and you can get it all. That's just not how it works when it spills from the bottom, which we learned at the Deepwater Horizon oil gusher. And so that does bring me to my Instagram post, which I left up there. I mean, it's embarrassing, but I wanted people to see my reaction to knowing that my favorite beaches, my home beaches, where I was raised, where I found peace and comfort and happiness my entire life, that they were being threatened by this oil. So I had my mental breakdown and some of the facts were wrong. It wasn't a tanker. It was the pipeline on the bottom. And we don't really know. We don't know the extent yet of the damage. We know that there's lots of oil washing up on Huntington Beach and that the Talbert wetlands are fucked. It seems right now, based on what the city of Huntington Beach is saying, is that they've been able to protect the Bolsa Chica wetlands. And let's really hope that that holds up because that's a really, really special place. I don't know how Newport Beach's Back Bay wetlands are doing. That's one of my favorite places. I go running back there. I go paddleboarding back there. I see so many birds and fish and it's a wonderful, wonderful place. I don't know how it's doing. And I don't know how they would keep the oil out because the channel there it's pretty wide. So I don't know. I do know that it has taken such a long time for the spill response to get up and running that the oil has now spread out quite a bit because one of the things that we're discovering here in California is that the private company that owns the oil rig and the pipeline and all that, they are the ones that are responsible for doing the response and the cleanup, which makes sense on paper until you actually have to do the response and cleanup. This is not an organization that has all of the boats that are required and all the manpower that is required on standby. And so as usual, it's not until the Coast Guard, it's not until the government gets involved that anything's actually fucking getting done. And in the meantime, the oil was still leaking and the oil was spreading out. And so we do have a big bunch of it apparently off the coast of Huntington Beach still. And there's another blob that's moving down towards San Clemente, which is kind of weird to me. I actually thought it would move north based on the current, but it's moving south, which does put Laguna Beach and my little octopus friends, and it puts the tide pools in danger. So, I mean, this is a slow rolling disaster in my hometown. I am fucking furious about it. And the thing is, whenever we talk about fossil fuels, it's so often connected to climate change, which is obviously important. But this is ruining the coast. And how many more times does this have to happen? Deepwater Horizon, I mean, they're still not recovered from that. I went down to Louisiana 8 months after that spill and saw just dead dolphins all over the beach. It takes a while for this stuff to play out. It takes a while for the animals to die and to roll up on the shores. And that is what my hometown is waiting for. So I am furious. And at the same time, I'm looking into this infrastructure bill. And so I want you to understand where some of this anger is coming from. It's coming from, not only are we heating up the climate and causing these extreme weather events that we're seeing, like how many times does the New York subway have to be drenched with water? How many more wildfires do we have to have that is now creating smoke seasons in all of California where we can't go outside for months at a time because the air is too disgusting to breathe? I mean, the consequences are becoming too obvious now on that regard. But even if you don't care about any of that, just drilling alone is so dangerous to the land and water. And it's currently killing too many creatures off the coast of Orange County. I'm fucking heartbroken and I am angry. And so that is where I'm coming from as I'm reading this bill, because this is making societal level decisions and we're not even a part of that conversation. And so now let's get into what this bill actually does. And I don't want to bury the big story here because I think that this should be at the center of the debate about this bill, not the process, not the reconciliation bill. Whenever this BIF infrastructure bill is discussed, the conversation should immediately turn to a discussion of whether or not we support a transition to a clean hydrogen economy, because that is what this bill defines as our national goal and authorizes billions of dollars to make it happen. Now, I was under the impression that the idea of a hydrogen-based economy as the future of the USA died along with Arnold Schwarzenegger's political career, because he did, as our governor after all, try to turn our highways into hydrogen highways. And I can tell you, I drove from Los Angeles to Seattle and back this year, and the only reliable fuel for doing all that driving remains gasoline. So that dream about just the highways, just hydrogen highways, it failed essentially because no one wanted it. State agencies here were given money to create hydrogen fueling stations, and they gave it back. Customers were also hesitant because of what I like to call the Hindenburg effect. Because I know when I think of hydrogen, I think of the Hindenburg blimp going down in an awesome ball of flames. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of driving around in cars powered by an explosive gas, whether they're rated safe or not, which, to be fair, everything I've read indicates that hydrogen-powered fuel cell vehicles are safe, but people weren't jumping on board with buying them when they became available. But the biggest problem with hydrogen as fuel is that no one has ever figured out how to produce and store enough hydrogen on a large enough scale to make people comfortable with buying hydrogen-powered cars, a problem that still hasn't been solved. And also, making hydrogen is an energy-intensive process. Unlike, say, gathering sunlight, which the sun provides for us for free without us having to do a damn thing. This is why the vast majority of serious discussions about transitioning away from fossil fuels for energy, held amongst people who actually want to do so, center around electrifying our transportation and powering our infrastructure with renewables like wind and solar. With batteries and creative grid configurations, the economy powered with solar, wind, and geothermal energy, truly renewable energy that costs nothing to produce, is absolutely possible by 2050. It will be challenging, of course, but we know we can do it. And I've included some sources explaining how, from sources like the Department of Energy and Popular Science and academic journals. There are so many that are available for you, like I said, in the show notes. But there are so many ways for you to learn how this can be done. There's different creative solutions, but the point is, it's possible. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The thing that is missing is funding from the government and regulations to force the unwilling industries to do the actual work. Which brings me back to BIF, which authorizes a total of $9.5 billion to be spent over the next 5 years on creating infrastructure to transition our economy to be powered by hydrogen. Now, to compare that investment, solar energy projects are funded with a total of $80 million. Although, to be fair, there are 5 projects funded with $500 million to test clean energy projects on former mining land, and solar power is required to be 2 of those 5 projects. The other 3 clean energy projects, by the way, can include fossil fuel energy generation with carbon capture, which is the first of just many instances in this bill where clean energy is redefined to include burning fossil fuels. But I looked up every single time solar was mentioned and funded in this bill, and that was pretty much it. And so even if we add those 2 test projects, that's about $180 million for solar compared to $9.5 billion for hydrogen. Wind energy is also similarly shortchanged because this bill only authorizes $100 million total for wind projects. There's also a clarification in here that this money is definitely not in addition to amounts that wind gets from another fund. And so to be honest with you, I'm not actually sure wind is getting anything additional out of this bill at all. But let's be generous and conservative here and say that it is. That's $100 million total for wind energy compared to $9.5 billion for hydrogen. Now, one of the reasons that those paid by fossil fuel interests say that wind and solar, against all evidence, is impractical is because they say it's unreliable because the battery storage technology isn't good enough yet. Which, as the wife of a utility-scale solar engineer, I do know that batteries need to improve, but I also know that the unreliability of wind and solar is greatly exaggerated because there are grid design solutions, like ones that integrate electric car batteries and smart timers to manage loads. There are solutions here in ways that can be designed to make this work. And so the idea that reliability is a problem is bullshit. But the idea that batteries could and should get better is true. So I think that's worth investing in. And so how much does the BIF invest in solving that problem so often cited by members of Congress who are so nervous about a clean energy system? They invest $505 million in batteries compared to $9.5 billion for hydrogen. In total, if you add all of the money for projects for truly renewable energies, the kind of energy harnessed from sources that generate themselves, so like solar, generated for free by the sun. Wind, generated for free by the movement of air. Hydropower, generated for free by the movement of water. Geothermal, generated for free by the volcano gods. And the battery storage research and projects to store that energy that they produce at odd hours. If you take all of that combined, renewable energy is funded with a total of $1.5 billion. Compared to $9.5 billion authorized for our transition to a clean hydrogen economy. And the money for renewable energy, by the way, is use it or lose it by 2025, while the hydrogen projects are funded through 2026. And I feel like this is a huge deal. No matter how you feel about hydrogen, because this just isn't like moving the goalposts. This is like showing up to a soccer game and being handed a rugby ball. Because until reading this bill, I was under the impression, and I've been reading bills and laws for almost a decade now. I also know what we have signed in international treaties. From all of this education that I have had over the last decade, I was under the impression that the goal was a truly green economy powered by renewable energy. Now, we've been told that natural gas, a fossil fuel, would be a bridge fuel to that. I was under the impression that the Republicans and corporate Democrats who take fossil fuel industry money were dragging their heels on the path to that. But this bill would put us on a totally different path, and we aren't even being told that we're switching directions. And since that conversation is not being had in the United States, I'd like to start it by saying that this is a terrible path for us to commit our money and our country to for the next 5 years. The reason is clear in the details of their plans for how they're going to invest our money into this transition to a hydrogen-powered economy. Their plan is to create 4 regional clean hydrogen hubs for production, processing, delivery, storage, and use of what they call clean hydrogen. And let's just take a beat to discuss clean hydrogen, because it does get an official definition in this bill. Basically, clean hydrogen is the same as hydrogen, and it can be produced from, quote, any fuel source, unquote. And so clean hydrogen can literally be produced from dirty fuels. The standard that it sets to be classified as clean hydrogen is that it has to have a carbon intensity of 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide per every kilogram of hydrogen produced. Did you catch that? For every unit of hydrogen produced, double the units of carbon dioxide can be produced in that process, and it can be labeled as clean. There's nothing clean about that. If the goal is to use hydrogen in order to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions, this whole setup of allowing fossil fuels to be used to make that hydrogen is a total scam. And out of the 4 hubs of hydrogen infrastructure that would be created with our $9.5 billion investment, at least one regional hub is required to demonstrate the production of, quote, clean hydrogen from fossil fuels, unquote. And that appears to be the actual goal of the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. This bill says that natural gas, which is a propaganda term for fossil fuel gas, should be used, quote, to the maximum extent practicable, unquote, to produce hydrogen. This bill says a long-term goal is to transition all our gas pipelines into hydrogen pipelines, which means we should keep building them. This bill says that coal should be used to produce hydrogen. And this bill says that hydrogen should be used for electric power generation, industry, residential and commercial heating, and transportation. By transitioning to a hydrogen economy, we basically would keep the fossil fuel industry in business. And it's very telling that the Hydrogen Council, which is a hydrogen industry group created in 2017, includes the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Saudi Aramco, Indian Oil Corporation, British Petroleum, Southern California Gas, Shell, Chevron, and other big oil and gas companies. And even worse, recent peer-reviewed research conducted by researchers at Cornell and Stanford universities, which was published in the Energy, Science, and Engineering Journal, has proven that this process of using fossil fuels to create hydrogen for energy is actually even worse for climate-changing emissions than just burning the damn fossil fuels. This is because fossil fuel gas, so-called natural gas, emits a lot of methane while being sucked out of the ground. And methane changes the climate even faster than carbon dioxide, even though it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long. And as the bill itself acknowledges, producing the hydrogen using fossil fuels for energy emits a lot of carbon dioxide. The study's main author, Robert Hawath of Cornell University, said, quote, "To call it zero emissions fuel is totally wrong. What we found is that it's not even a low emissions fuel either," unquote. Now, the plan, as outlined in BIF for dealing with the undeniable reality that it takes energy to create hydrogen, and that this bill intends for fossil fuels to be burned to do it, the plan is to neutralize those emissions with carbon capture technology. And this bill authorizes $6 billion to fund carbon capture projects. So the great news that I discovered researching this episode is that carbon capture technology has shifted from a dream to a reality. There's a huge facility in Iceland, the largest one in existence, that opened last month and should be able to suck approximately 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide out of the air each year. Now, paired with a drastic reduction in our carbon dioxide emissions, this is excellent and exciting news because we might be able to keep the climate from warming so quickly that our society can't adapt in time. Like our crops might be able to grow where they grow now, and our cities might stay above water. This is fantastic news. But this technology cannot be used as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels. Carbon capture at the level that's possible today won't even put a dent in mitigating our fossil fuel burning habits as they stand now. So, for example, in 2019, the United States emitted 5.28 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so that means just to break even, we would have to build 1,450,000 of those carbon capture facilities, the same scale as the one in Iceland, the largest one in the world. And that would cost us $21.7 trillion to do. That's a real heavy price tag just to break even, all so that we can keep burning fossil fuels. And let's also keep in mind that continuing to drill for oil and gas, which carbon capture or not, drilling will always poison land, air, and water. We've proven this so many times. There's no way around it. We need to transition away from burning the bodies of the long ago dead for energy to harnessing the energy we have all around us for free with no risk of mass poisoning as fast as possible, regardless of these climatic shifts. But in terms of those avoidable extreme climate shifts, carbon capture is only a solution to the problem if drilling and burning of fossil fuels is phased out at the same time. And this bill certainly doesn't do that. First of all, this bill invests so heavily in maintaining transportation networks that are currently powered by fossil fuels, as in vehicles. This bill authorizes more than $273 billion for the Highway Trust Fund, over $250 billion for highways. And out of that money, because a lot of this conversation, when we talk about infrastructure, so many of us focus on fixing our bridges. Well, you should know that less than $3.3 billion of that $273 billion will be spent on fixing all of our decrepit old bridges, which, I know a lot of us are concerned about this because right now, 42% of our 617,000 bridges are over 50 years old, and 7.5% of those, so 46,000 of our bridges, are considered structurally deficient, as in they're in poor condition, as in they could fall down. The estimate for how much money is needed to fix those bridges is $125 billion. But the BIF authorizes less than $3.3 billion to fix our bridges. So I know that we have a need here, but if this bill goes down, how much are we actually missing out on? Now, there are other ways to at least help with our bridge problem. And one of them would be to reduce the stress on those bridges by taking as many heavy-ass cars off the road as we can. This would not only reduce the pressure on the roads and bridges, which are so expensive to maintain, but it would also reduce traffic for the people who love driving cars. Because there are plenty of people like me who hate being in cars. For me, it's mainly because I know that about 35,000 Americans die in car crashes every year. And that's a number that's rising, by the way, which makes vehicle transportation one of our most dangerous modes of transportation. But I have to drive because in so many places in this country, I have no other choice. And so give me a train, a ferry, or a clean bus, and I will take it every time. I choose vacations based on what has a good public transportation network. I've chosen homes based on where public transportation is. And so how much funding do other less fossil fuel centered modes of transportation, like the ones that I like to take, how much money did they get in the BIF? Well, ferries get $570 million compared again to $273 billion for vehicle infrastructure. And one of the infuriating things about this ferry money is that it can be used by the government to pay 85% of the costs of retrofitting diesel, aka fossil fuel ferries. Now, this subsidy for fossil fuel powered ferries is infuriating because large electric ferry boats already exist and have for a long time. Norway has been using them since 2014. In fact, there's an electric ferry boat operating here in the United States right now. The Pioneer Electric Ferry is in rural Alabama, of all places. That boat cost $1.8 million to invent and create and was partially paid for by an Environmental Protection Agency Diesel Emissions Reduction Act grant. But instead of expanding that program and putting more electric ferries into our waters, the BIF would keep the fossil fuel guzzling dinosaurs on life support. Then there's transit funding, which funds things like light rails and buses. The BIF authorizes a little under $70 billion for transit projects. $70 billion for transit, which again helps reduce traffic and can be fully electrified now. Because like light rail, they're often electric. And like Santa Monica down the street from here, where I'm currently recording under a blanket in Marina Del Rey. Well, Santa Monica just started using a bunch of electric buses. They exist. They work. So funding transit is funding a transition to a clean economy. But again, check out the difference in investment, $70 billion for transit compared to $273 billion for highways. And yes, I know that electric buses and electric cars use the highways. And if that were the intention of this bill, I'd be more open to that level of funding. But the BIF actually contains a provision designed to test something that would disincentivize people from switching from fossil fuel powered cars to electric cars. Because the BIF would create a pilot program to test a national motor vehicle per mile user fee. Because right now the Highway Trust Fund is funded with gas taxes. And so switching to user fees to fund the highway fund takes away some of the financial incentive for driving electric vehicles and dealing with the current hassles that come with being early adopters. I drive a plug-in electric hybrid car, and I've got to tell you, finding a charger has been a pain in my ass since I got the car in May 2018. I've talked about it on many thank you episodes. We're dealing with it here again. This new Airbnb that I'm staying in, I don't have a garage. And so there's a charger around the corner, but there's no sign there that says that you can't park there if you don't have a EV. And so a lot of times people just use that space for parking. And so we basically just have to walk over there every few hours and see if it's available. I mean, it's a pain in the ass to have one charger in this entire community, but this is what we deal with. And so a user fee would even the financial playing field between driving fossil fuel powered cars and EV cars, which is the exact opposite of what you would want to do if you want to disincentivize the purchase of fossil fuel burners as part of a societal transition to electrified transportation. And as for a network of charging stations for people like Joe and I, who generally live in apartments and therefore can't charge in our garage, money for that was in the House bill, but that bill was essentially thrown in the trash. And so, ferries are funded, but the money will keep fossil fuel guzzlers on the water. EV chargers are not funded, and a test will be run to see how the country reacts to taxing EVs and fossil fuel guzzlers equally, despite the much larger share of damage to the environment through pollution and emissions caused by those who continue to choose fossil fuel burning vehicles. But how about rail? Well, the BIF funds Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, which is the part of the country where the government controls the tracks and is therefore able to implement a fair and reliable right-of-way system. Well, the Northeast, which is the only place where Amtrak is reliable at all, gets a little over $6.5 billion from this bill. The rest of the country, where private freight companies were somehow permitted to own our tracks and can give their own trains unfair right-of-way privileges, making it impossible for Amtrak to maintain a reliable schedule for passenger trains, well, that most of the country gets about $12.6 billion for passenger trains. In total, passenger rail gets about $19 billion. Again, compare that, $19 billion, to $273 billion for highways. And please remember that anytime someone says how expensive rail is or would be. Constantly fixing potholes, that's expensive. Policing drivers, that's expensive. Cleaning up crashes, that's expensive. Cancers and other illnesses that we have to treat because people live next to busy 24/7 polluting roads, that's expensive. Keeping multi-lane bridges from falling down, that's expensive. Highways are expensive. And this bill does not put us on a path towards needing fewer of them, because not only does it severely underinvest in rail infrastructure, but the bill also does nothing to solve the fatal flaw of Amtrak in most of the country, that private companies get to control the tracks. I mean, can you imagine if we let UPS and FedEx control the airports? Do you really think the passenger airlines would get to run reliable schedules? Or would the private companies prioritize their own planes to schlep shit around? You know, we don't allow that in the skies or on the highways for that matter. Like Amazon doesn't own and determine right of way on our roads. So why the f do we allow that on our tracks? That is the main hurdle to having a passenger rail system that's worth using outside of the Northeast. I did a whole episode about this a long time ago now, but nothing has changed. And so it's still relevant. And I put it in the show notes for you. But until that issue is fixed, passenger rail in the United States will never compete with vehicles and planes, with fossil fuel powered transportation in this country. And this bill will definitely keep it that way. The only thing this bill does in that regard is it changes the goals of Amtrak to include that they improve their contracts with rail carriers over whose track Amtrak operates, which doesn't do shit. Amtrak is not the problem here. This bill also adds a bunch of busy work to Amtrak too, like more reports and more studies. But it's not Amtrak that is causing this. It's the private sector that's the problem. The private sector shouldn't own the nation's tracks. And so fixing this problem will mean taking something away from private companies. And this bill refuses to do that in any provisions that I've read. They don't get taxed or required to do anything. For example, the only step that this bill takes towards expanding passenger rail in this country is to pass out carrots to private industry like this country is a zoo full of bunnies. This bill would pay the operating costs of, quote, any rail carrier, unquote, so that includes private companies, that provide passenger rail service from 3 years to 6 years and pays higher percentages of the costs. But here's the thing, there's no requirement that any new routes be created by Amtrak or any of the private companies that currently own our tracks. It's like, here's a bunch of tax money in case you, all on your own, because the market must be free, but you can decide if our nation's tracks should be used to move humans around comfortably. You don't want to? No biggie. It's all carrots here. No sticks. Well, no sticks unless you're an employee, because there is a provision in here subjecting all railroad mechanics to random drug testing. So there are some sticks, but just not for private industry. No, we can't have that. Here's another example of how beyond coddling this bill is to private railroad companies that control most of our tracks. So this provision that I want to tell you about, upon first glance, actually looks like sort of a good idea. It's at least the beginning of a good idea, but poorly executed. The good idea part is to create a way for citizens and first responders to complain about trains that block roads. We've all been stuck at that intersection with a train that never fucking ends. You're there for 20 minutes and then it goes by and then you can keep driving. We've all experienced this. But there are times that train's not moving at all. The road's just blocked. And if you're someone who's in that ambulance, that could be a life or death situation. And so apparently we don't have a way to report any of that to either the government or the private companies. And so the good idea is to create a way to submit those reports. But the poor execution part of this is that the portal for those complaints would be authorized for only 3 years and would provide every person submitting the complaint the contact information of the relevant railroad and would encourage them to complain to them too. And so first of all, why would this only be authorized for 3 years? This seems like something that should be permanent. And second, why not automatically forward the complaints? This process would pass the responsibility back to the Good Samaritan who's reporting the issue in the first place, who probably doesn't even know that our tracks are owned by private railroad companies because what kind of country allows that to happen? And then finally, this provision protects the private railroad operators from repercussions of trains blocking roads because information collected would not be allowed to be used for any regulatory or enforcement purposes. And so basically, poor management of our tracks can't be punished and new rules can't be created based off of complaints from citizens or first responders. Even if there's millions of complaints, it doesn't matter. In fact, I'm seeing some possible maybe unintended, I hope it's unintended, immunity granted in this language because the way I read it, if something is complained about, this prevents the government from acting. It literally ties the hands of people trying to govern so that no private railroad company will be inconvenienced by these reports, even if it's their management of the tracks that causes trains to have to sit and block intersections. It's like if it's in this complaints and the government can't act on the complaints, wouldn't submitting a complaint equal the private company can't get in trouble for whatever is in that complaint? Like, this is madness. And if that doesn't prove to you that this bill coddles private industry to an extreme degree, then, well, this will. This provision. There's a provision in here that says that at most 5 years after this becomes law, if it becomes law, freight cars on trains will be prohibited from operating within the United States if more than 15% of the car is manufactured in a country of concern or in state-owned facilities. Now, hearing this will send a red flag flying for all longtime listeners of Congressional Dish, because starting with episode 102, I became aware of our role in this world, the reason we have military bases everywhere, and the goal we are devoted to pushing on the international level. Basically, a thesis that just keeps on ringing true to me the more I learn about it, is that our country is trying, along with our partners in the World Trade Organization, to enact a global economic system that centers around the idea that multinational corporations should be free to operate and profit everywhere in the world. In this system, which has rules dictated by its loan shark arm, the International Monetary Fund, any company owned in full or even in part by a country, by a government, is bad. Everything that can be privatized should be, which goes to explain why we here in the United States have allowed our train tracks to be sold off to private companies, and why no one in this Congress is trying to change it. It goes to explain why we don't have health care included as a return on our tax investment like most other parts of the world. The Congresses of my lifetime have been devoted to the privatization of everything. And so government-controlled companies, state-owned companies, in this economic religion are bad and must be treated as enemies to be destroyed. And so again, if the BIF becomes law, freight cars will be prohibited from operating within the United States if more than 15% of that car is manufactured in state-owned facilities. And this provision against government-owned companies has sharp teeth, because the Secretary of Transportation can assess fines between a minimum of $100,000 and $250,000 per freight car. A company that's been found in violation 3 times can be kicked out of the United States transportation system until they're in compliance and they've paid all their fines in full. Now let's compare this to the enforcement experienced by the company that has spilled oil all over my home beaches in Orange County, because that oil rig is operating in federal waters, which means for anyone, because I've seen plenty of this on Twitter, for anyone who's been laughing at the fact that green old California is covered in oil right now, like, ha, 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 you lectured to the world, but you're so stupid. You deserve what you get. We've been protecting on a state level our coasts for my entire life. California banned new offshore oil leases when I was a child. We are being affected by oil in waters controlled at the national level by the Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C., and I could not possibly be angrier about it. And the company that owns the rigs and the pipeline is a company from, of course, Texas, called Amplify Energy. And the pipeline that spilled all the oil is 41 years old. Federal inspectors have cited that company 125 times. And 72 of those were severe enough that the company had to fix the violation before they could resume operations. In 2013 and 2014, that company was fined $85,000 total for violations, 2 of which injured the company's workers, and 1 which caused a smaller oil spill after a safety vice was just bypassed. $85,000 for spilling oil into our ocean. Now let's compare that with the enforcement ordered for freight companies simply because they're owned by governments instead of companies that funnel money to the shareholder class. They would be fined a minimum of $100,000. Up to $250,000 and be subject to 3 strikes and you're out of the country. Why didn't we have 125 strikes and your rig is done drilling off the coast of California? I can tell you why. Because keeping fossil fuels, keeping that industry, that is what our Congress's priorities have been for my entire lifetime. Their priorities are also to protect the multinationals from violations and competition if the BIF is to be believed. This is all so backwards, and it's also so off the national media's radar, which I think is intentional since the multinationals fund the corporate media with their ads. You know, if this becomes law, the issue of infrastructure will be considered finished for the next 5 years. We will be locked in. So that is why I don't want this to become law, despite the fact that I know that we have to fix our bridges. I know we have to fix the highways. I know that we have too many potholes. I know we need this investment. But again, they are making societal level decisions. This is going to govern our infrastructure for the next 5 years, half a decade. That's a long time. But if this fails, then infrastructure will still be on the to-do list. We get to elect a whole new House of Representatives next year, and we can replace a third of the Senate. In the Senate, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, the two Democrats who have been a pain in the ass, well, they will both be eligible for firing in 3 years, along with the entire House of Representatives and again, a third of the Senate. We have two opportunities within that 5-year window that this bill would cover to elect people who will enact the legislation that we need to transition us away from fossil fuels. But those two opportunities drop to zero if infrastructure is considered done. But big picture, Democrats need to decide what they stand for. I have documented time and time again that Republicans represent fossil fuel interests and do so in lockstep, which is proven by their many, many united votes for bills that keep us hooked on fossil fuels. The entire party is captured by fossil fuel interests and can be written off and should be voted out of office. But the Democrats right now are not an alternative. There is one group of Democrats, they call themselves progressives, that really is trying to transition us away from fossil fuels. But there is another larger group, the corporate Democrats. A lot of them call themselves blue dogs. But it doesn't take putting your paws on 3 clues to figure out that they are also, just like Republicans, using every trick in the book to greenwash our continued reliance on fossil fuels for energy. Because you know who put that $9.5 billion program that funds projects to transition us to a hydrogen economy into the bill? You know who did that? Democrat Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, whose family owns a coal company, which he has collected millions of dollars from while he has been a senator. Remember, coal can be used to make hydrogen if you don't give two shits about the climate or pollution or the detrimental effects of mining. And he's also the #1 recipient in this Congress of money from people in the coal mining, gas transmission, and oil and gas production industries. So he got $9.5 billion, at least if this does become law. He will have gotten $9.5 billion of our money authorized to go towards a transition to a hydrogen economy, which almost none of us know about. And I know that very few of us have approved of. $9.5 billion. This bill has $3.3 billion going towards fixing bridges. 3 times as much for hydrogen than fixing bridges. You know, when we talk about the infrastructure bill, I think a lot of us assuming that they're fixing fucking bridges. So the numbers tell you what the priorities are. And with Democrats like these, you might as well vote Republican and set the oceans and the climate on fire. Like, are there no standards in these parties? How can a party that runs on green energy, election after election, allow Joe Manchin to be in its club? This can't continue. The Democrats either need to be for a true transition to clean energy, or they need to be written off too. Because we're not going to accomplish this enormous and important goal, one that we've told the world we are on board with one party writing laws for fossil fuels and the other party writing laws with clever workarounds by, for example, keeping the fossil fuel gas industry profitable by pretending a hydrogen economy is a reasonable replacement for an electrified economy powered by renewables. It would be laughable if it wasn't so damn serious. And so there you go. That's why I hate BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. And I don't consider this a bipartisan win, which is how the New York Times described it when it passed. It's not a win for anyone if the bill traps us on the wrong path for 5 years, which is exactly what this would do. And so now I understand better why the progressives are willing to let this lemon rot if they don't get their reconciliation bill. And I support their strategy even more than I already did, as long as reconciliation isn't gutted to the point of uselessness, which is a distinct possibility. It's tough to actually say if you can support what they're doing because we don't really know what they're doing with that other bill. We're just going to have to wait and see. I'm so sick of this Congress, I could scream. But what I'm not sick of is the producers of Congressional Dish. I love you guys. I don't always love this job, to be completely honest, but knowing that we are in this together is one of the things that keeps me going through all of this frustration. You know, all producers get thanked on bonus thank you episodes, and so I would like to hear your thoughts about this. If you have any questions about the BIF, like I said, there's a lot more provisions that I didn't talk about. If this becomes law, I will go through every one of them in detail, let you know how it would affect you. But this was the big stuff. But if you have any questions, if you look through the outline, there's anything you want to talk about, please submit that with your donations. I am happy to go even deeper down this rabbit hole if you want to. But at the end of main episodes, this is when I do like to thank our executive producers. And these are people that either through lump sums or many, if not most over time, contribute a total of $535 to Congressional Dish and therefore get to have your name listed on an episode of your choice as an executive producer. Because I feel like you should get to choose which episode you're proud to have your name listed on. And we do have a executive producer credit to announce today. So I'm super excited to see this name. This is a longtime producer of Congressional Dish and the owner of some beautiful animals, or at least one. Bryn, the pup, is owned by Jose Huerta. And Jose Huerta is going to be our executive producer on Congressional Dish 237, Hunting Domestic Terrorists. And this is the note that he sent in for the community. He said, "Greetings from Ontario, Oregon. No, I haven't moved. If you look at Ontario on a map, we're still kind of in the Treasure Valley in Idaho. Congratulations on finding a new assistant. I'm happy we can go back to 2 episodes per month. Me too. Enclosed is a check that should complete another executive producer credit for me. If correct, I would like it to be applied to episode 237. That's an amazing episode. Though not surprised, they're always amazing episodes. Stay amazing, Jose Huerta." Well, thank you so much for supporting the show, Jose. I am honored to share the executive producer line with you. And that episode, I also think was super important. So thank you for supporting it. And thank you to all other producers. Again, we're going through another funding slump, which I cannot explain. But as you may have noticed, or at least you will when you go and check out my sources in this episode's show notes, congressionaldish.com is actually professionally designed now. So I could use some help paying for that. And just basically to keep the show going. I adore you guys. I am very tired to reading this bill. And so, yeah, if you supported this, if you got value from it, please support the show. And you can find out how on congressionaldish.com. All right. I love you. And I will be back for a thank you episode next week. Sure. I'll have things to tell you next week. Until then, take care of yourselves and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.